Okay, so I spoke about a neuron. I spoke about the dendrites. I already mentioned two general types of neuron, the spiny and the smooth. I already spoke about two different types of neurons when I spoke about functionality, because I spoke about excitatory neurons and I spoke about inhibitory neurons. So there are many ways to classify neurons. And speaking about neuron types. But maybe before going into the neuron types, let me just mention something that I should have mentioned before, that of course in our brain there are so many neurons, and the last counting of how many neurons you have in your brain is very, very close to 100 billion or 100 milliard, meaning 10 to the power of 11. Huge number of cells in very many regions, some more dense, some less dense, but you know that your brain is built from so many elements, 100 billion of cells. And so can we speak about each cell as a separate, individual, different, not in terms of not being connected, but type? Or can we speak about classes of cell types? Like when you go to the jungle, you say, this is one class of tree, this is another class of tree. So we can also do the same thing in terms of types or classes of neurons. We can classify neurons by anatomical features. As I said, you can use the anatomy of the dendrites, the shape of the dendrite, to classify neurons and say, this is cerebellar Purkinje cell, this is pyramidal cell from layer 5 of the neocortex, this is pyramidal cell from CA1 of the hippocampus, and so on. So this is anatomical features, using anatomical features to classify different cell types. We can also classify neurons in terms of functionality, as I said. I can say this neuron is excitatory because it sends excitation. It wants to activate the postsynaptic cell, or this cell is inhibitory. This is another type of functional classification. And this is actually the broadest classification, functional classification, I can say about the brain. That the brain consists of two types of cells in terms of function. One type tries to inhibit the brain, to control activity, reduce activity, and another type, the excitatory, tries to excite the brain. And it is indeed the balance between the two. In your brain, the balance between excitation and inhibition is really what makes the brain functional. You don't want too much excitation. It may cause epilepsy. You don't want too much inhibition because the brain then is not active, it doesn't function. You all the time seek for a balance. That's a very interesting puzzle, the balance between excitation and inhibition, but this is the two general types, excitation, inhibition. I can also classify neurons by the electrical characterization or characteristics. Some, as you will see, some cells like to fire more spikes, some cells like to fire less spike, and also with the different patterns of activity. So you can classify neurons by electrical types, morphological or anatomical types, electrical types, functional types. I can also classify neurons by their chemical characteristics. What chemicals consist of a particular cell type? And because today we can use chemicals, stain chemicals, we can see that this cell consists of this type of chemical and another cell of this another type of cell chemical, and so on. So chemical characterization. And of course, you can also use the gene expression. Which genes are expressed in what type of cell? So I can ask the general question, how many cell types we have in the brain? Is each cell a different type? Or can I say this is layer 5 pyramidal cell, and all of the pyramidal cells in layer 5 are the same? This cell is layer 2, 3 pyramidal cell. This cell is layer 1, and so on. Can I use this, or can I speak about each cell separately? This is an interesting work. It's not final. We think that our cortex, for example, depending on which criterion are you using for typing the cells, for classifying the cells, probably have several thousand cell types. Again, depending on the typing of the cell. An example, I take a network in the cortex, just examples of several cell types. Immediately you see this big, beautiful layer 5 pyramidal cell dendrites with the blue axons that may go out. They do go out from this region to other regions. And you can see all these local neurons with the dendritic tree red and the axonal tree locally. So this is indeed another general characterization of cell types. Usually we say that these big excitatory pyramidal cells and other excitatory cells, where they have this axonal projection out of this local region, we call them projection or principal neurons, because they are principal in the sense that they send from local processing outside to other regions through long axons. And we call other neurons, like this one, for example, or this one, interneurons, usually inhibitory neurons, interneurons, because they are inside the region, and the axonal tree only talks locally. So here is another characterization. Usually the excitatory cells in the cortex are principal projecting cells outside of this region, and the inhibitory population, this one and this one and this one, are local, are interneurons. So principals versus interneurons. These are important classification to try to understand the system of this local inhibitory control and more globally sending information to other regions, excitatory information. And if you zoom in, just recently, there was an attempt to classify inhibitory neurons into classes, into types. A very recent work from 2013 by Javier de Felipe, the great Spaniard anatomist. I sometimes call him the grandson of Ramon y Cajal, although he's not a real grandson, but intellectually. And they, a group of people, sitting trying to decide, based on morphology, how many interneuron types, how many inhibitory types you have. And you can see that they are using the dendritic tree as a signature for type. So you will call this beautiful dendritic tree a chandelier cell, because it looks like a chandelier, And you will call this cell basket because it generates like a basket connection through the axon in this case. So in this case, they use the axonal structure that is engulfing the postsynaptic cell like this, like baskets. The horse tail, this is another cell type, and so forth, the Martinotti. So you can see that you can start to make some order. It's not a complete jungle in a sense of types. For some reason that is not completely clear, absolutely not yet, why do we have the different types? Why don't we have just one inhibitory type, one excitatory type, and finish with it? Why do we need all these little characters, each one with different shapes? Each one makes contacts to different direction and with different postsynaptic cells. It's not a jungle. It's an orderly system that is doing function, speaking, talking, feeling. So these are the basic elements in the inhibitory system. We can do the same for the excitatory group of cells. One is called pyramidal cell in layer 5. Another one is called spiny stellate cell in layer 4. So I'm not going to elaborate on that. So this is morphological characterization or classification using morphology as the parameter for classification. But I can also use, as I said before, the electrical base classification, so based on the spiking pattern of neurons. So for example, if you record from one neuron, the spikes of one neuron, you see that one neuron is doing ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta very intensely. If you record from another neuron, he fires spikes, but in a sparse kind of way. We call it stutterer, because it stutters. Ta-ta-ta, ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta, a stutterer. Another stutterer. So there are different types based on the electrical activity. And each one of these cells has an electrical character. This type of cell wants to do ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta, and then accommodates slower and slower. So very fast beginning and slower here. This is a regular firer. It fires very regularly, fires spike after spike with a very regular intervals. So we'll call it a regular firer and so on. And so this characterization, which is independent of the morphology, the morphological characterization is just based on how you speak electrically. I like to speak very strongly, fast. I like to speak more regularly. I'm a solid person. This one starts very fast and then becomes tired a little bit, and then he fires less. This one is completely statutory. He doesn't succeed to speak continuously, so he spikes like this. And there must be some functional meaning to all that, which again, we don't completely understand, but it's important to see that inside the spiking mechanism, which again, we should speak a lot about the spiking mechanism of cells, there are different types of spiking mechanism, this one, and this one. So you can characterize the cells as they did here through this blue brain database. We can see different types of cells.